When we think of pioneers traveling west in covered wagons, we tend to picture an epic adventure full of excitement and opportunity. But what if I told you that most of the time it was actually a nightmare? A nightmare that turned from bad to worse the minute the weather took a turn? You see, life on the frontier had this nasty habit of turning from adventure to horror overnight. Our brave settlers usually arrived with dreams of fertile land, a cozy cabin, and the kind of freedom that city life couldn't offer. But winter didn't care about their dreams. Sometimes it came early, faster than anyone expected, swallowing entire valleys in snow before crops were harvested or roofs were properly finished. Imagine hauling everything you own across miles of wilderness, only to find yourself stuck in a wooden shack with holes big enough for the wind to whistle through like a death song. What's that? You can hear the wind. It's howling outside, isn't it? The small fire in the corner of the shack does little to ward off the chill, and the faces around it are drawn and haggard. Even the dog seems to sense the danger and whines softly. Is that the sound of footsteps in the distance? Could salvation be at hand, or is it just another lost soul coming to die with them? Because there's no salvation in this God-forsaken place. There's only the long, dark journey into death itself. Well, obviously this pioneer family is doomed. So let's skip ahead a few days. The snow continues to fall relentlessly, piling up against the cabin walls. Each flake a tiny hammer blow, forcing the family further into their frozen hell. Food is a problem. They had flour, a little salted pork, maybe some beans, but hunting is nearly impossible in this weather, and every bite now has to be rationed. The travelers are trapped, cut off from the rest of civilization by the very forces that brought them together. The relentless snow, the bitter cold, it's a deadly trap that threatens to snuff out their lives one by one. Will they succumb to the cold, the hunger, or will they be saved? Well, that depends on whether you want to live in a world where hope flickers like a candle in the wind or dies and leaves nothing but ashes. Hey there, welcome to Life Noggin. Before we move on, we'd like to thank you for your support. Now back to the bloody story. Throughout the 1800s, travelers moving across the Great Plains often found themselves battling the elements, contending with harsh conditions that could quickly turn a journey that began with excitement into a desperate fight for survival. As the snow fell, the temperature dropped and food supplies dwindled. Each day brought new challenges, and the constant threat of death loomed over the travelers. The sound of the wind and snow piling up against the cabin walls wasn't a peaceful lullaby, but a harsh reminder that escape was now impossible. Outside, the storm raged on, determined to bury any hope of rescue under a thick blanket of snow. The travelers huddled together for warmth, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. With each passing hour, the darkness outside and inside the cabin grew deeper, mirroring the despair that settled in their hearts. The scent of wood smoke carried on the wind, a faint promise of warmth and company. But it was a cruel trick of the elements, a tease of comfort that offered no respite from the relentless cold. Hope, once a steady flame, flickered precariously in the face of their grim reality. The travelers knew that their fate hung in the balance, and the question of survival became a battle against the relentless march of winter. The diaries of many travelers tell of those who didn't make it, who succumbed to the unforgiving terrain and bitter cold. Some accounts speak of groups sitting down in the snow, too tired to go on. Others tell of bodies found frozen solid, their final moments a silent testament to the brutality of the frontier. But these stories aren't just tales of hardship and loss. They're also a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity, the will to survive against all odds. Despite the grim reality that surrounded them, many travelers refused to give in. They kept moving, driven by the hope of reaching a place of safety and warmth. They pushed on, their steps leaving fleeting imprints in the pristine snow, their determination a beacon in the vast expanse of winter's domain. Their journeys may have been fraught with peril, but their spirits remained unbroken, refusing to be extinguished by the icy grip of the frontier. So did they make it, you ask? Well, that depends on whether you want to believe in happy endings or face the harsh truth of history. When you imagine a settler cabin, you probably picture a cozy little log home just waiting for someone to move right in. But that's not how people lived in those frontier cabins, at least not in the winter. Hi everyone, welcome to this house. Today we are exploring the realities of living in a pioneer cabin in the winter. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. In the paintings, we often see these cute little cabins nestled in a snowy landscape with smoke curling up from their chimneys. And there is some truth to those paintings, but only some. There were no glass windows to keep out the drafts, just gaps between the logs that were filled with mud or moss during construction. In the summer, these gaps could be sealed with sawdust and plaster, but in the deep winter, the wind would always find a way in. To keep warm inside, family members would huddle together, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they owned, including the one covering their beds, which were usually just straw pallets on the floor. Frost would grow thick on the inside of the cabin walls. The only source of warmth was the fireplace, which was supposed to be the heart of the home, but it was both a blessing and a curse. It gave heat, light, and a place to cook, but it also sucked oxygen from the room, smoked out the inhabitants, and required endless wood. Cutting firewood was backbreaking work, but not cutting enough meant freezing to death. So men, women, and children chopped wood nearly every waking hour to keep their families alive. Sparks from the fireplace would jump onto the dry timber, and occasionally the cabin would burn down, leaving the family to wander the frozen wilderness in search of a new home. Or the roof would cave in under the weight of the snow, trapping the family inside until spring. Just imagine being stuck in one of these cabins during a month-long blizzard. You're huddled by the fireplace with your family, breathing the smoke-filled air, watching your bread grow stale. Outside, the wind is whipping and the snow is piling up. You know that when it stops snowing, you will need to step outside and start chopping wood. But for now, you can only watch the snow fall and hope that spring comes soon. The families who lived in these cabins didn't have indoor plumbing, of course, but they also didn't have outhouses. They couldn't dig holes in the frozen ground, so they did the next best thing. They created a cat hole and used that. The spot was usually behind the cabin and some distance from the front door. In warmer weather, it might have been a good spot, but in the winter, the families had to trudge through the snow to get there, making the journey very unpleasant. Once they reached the tree line, they would do their business and hurry back to the cabin before the cold seeped into their bones. When they returned, they had to shake the snow from their boots to prevent bringing more dirt and germs inside. During the winter, people didn't step outside unless they absolutely had to. The sun wasn't strong enough to warm them, and the cold would quickly sap their energy. If they needed to venture out to chop wood or check on their animals, they bundled up in layers, tucked their heads down, and hurried to their destination. Sometimes they tethered strings to their wrists so they wouldn't lose a glove in the snow. They made sure to stay on the path to avoid sinking in the snowdrifts, but sometimes they slipped anyway. Then they had to help each other up, making sure not to smile too widely and expose any skin. When they finally reached their destination, they repeated the process to make sure they didn't lose anything else. When the settlers went out into the world, they took their domesticated animals with them. This included cows, pigs, chickens, and dogs. Most of the time, the animals stayed close to the cabin, but sometimes the pioneers found their livestock frozen solid, standing like statues in the snow. Life on the frontier was harsh, but it was a life full of beauty as well. The pioneers learned to appreciate the small things, like the smell of fresh pine after a snowfall or the sight of an animal crossing the ice-jammed creek. Even though the cabins weren't much to look at, they were warm and safe havens for the families who lived in them. And that's what mattered most. Thank you all for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Which part of pioneer life did you like the least? Let me know down below in the comments section. While you're there, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. I would also like to take a moment to say a special thank you to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. I'll see you next time. The frontier had a polite nickname for winter, the starvation season. No matter how much you thought you had stored, supplies always ran short. Families boiled leather straps into soup. They ground bark and roots into flour, and they chewed on frozen horse meat when the animals finally collapsed. The mental strain was just as harsh. Days were short, nights endless. Hunger gnawed at the mind, making tempers flare. Diaries describe fathers staring silently at the empty shelves, mothers crying quietly while children asked when spring would come. It was a slow grind, not dramatic like in the movies. Most deaths came from malnutrition and weakness, not sudden disaster. Some neighbors helped each other, but others locked their doors. If your family had just enough food to maybe survive until thaw, you weren't about to share. Harsh, yes, but in the frontier world, survival wasn't about kindness. It was about who could last longer without breaking. I sure hope that I do run out of food before I get to tell the next part of this story. But if I do, well, you'll just have to use your imagination, won't you? What's that? You want me to show you what people ate during the winter on the frontier? Well, all right, but first, why don't you stick around to the end of this video? And don't forget to stay updated so you never miss an exciting episode. Thanks. Now let's see what frontiers people were chowing down on during the long winter months. As the snow fell and the temperature dropped, the frontier's bounty shifted from gardens and livestock to more, shall we say, exotic fare. With traditional food sources like fresh vegetables and meat becoming scarce, resourceful frontiersmen and women turned to a variety of wild foods to sustain themselves through the winter. One of the most common and accessible sources of sustenance was game meat. Animals such as squirrels, rabbits, and deer provided a rich source of protein and fat, which were essential for staying warm and maintaining energy levels. Hunting these animals required skill and knowledge of their habits, but the rewards were worth it. In addition to game meat, many frontiersmen also turned to fishing as a means of obtaining protein. Fish was an excellent source of nutrition and could be prepared in a variety of ways, including smoking and drying for long-term storage. Trapping smaller animals such as rabbits and foxes was also a popular way to obtain food during the winter months. These animals could be kept alive until spring, or they could be butchered and their pelts used for clothing and blankets. But what about the plants, you ask? Well, the frontier's plant life also provided a variety of edible options. Foraging for things like berries, nuts, and wild greens was a common practice, and these foods provided essential vitamins and minerals. Some plants could be processed into flour, while others could be dried and used as tea. Even the roots and bark of certain trees were not only edible, but highly nutritious. Of course, no discussion of frontier food would be complete without mentioning corn. This versatile grain could be ground into cornmeal, which was then used to make a variety of dishes, including cornbread, mush, and tortillas. Corn was a staple of the frontier diet and was often the main ingredient in many meals. Finally, let us not forget about the role of livestock on the frontier diet. While hunting and foraging were important sources of food, many families also raised their own animals, including cows, pigs, chickens, and goats. These animals provided a reliable source of meat, milk, and eggs, which were essential for survival. In fact, the raising of livestock was not only a means of obtaining food, but also a symbol of wealth and status among the frontier's inhabitants. As you can see, the frontier diet was a mix of necessity and resourcefulness. From hunting and fishing to foraging and farming, frontiersmen and women did not let the harsh environment dictate their survival. They adapted, they innovated, and they persevered. And while their meals may not have been plentiful or predictable, they were a testament to the human spirit's ability to survive even in the harshest conditions. So there you have it, a glimpse into the diverse and resilient diet of the American frontier. If you enjoyed learning about the frontier diet, stay tuned for more videos that bring history to life. You might think the wilderness was a peaceful, snow-covered wonderland, but nature wasn't sleeping. Wolves followed the scent of weakness. Bears sometimes woke from hibernation if desperate enough, and if you were unlucky enough to leave your cabin for firewood, you risked becoming their meal. But often the most dangerous enemy was the cold itself. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers. Hypothermia made people strip off their clothes in a final, confusing burst of heat before collapsing in the snow. Farmers sometimes froze just yards away from their cabin doors because storms blinded them. Wild animals were terrifying, but they were honest. The cold was worse. It came silently, crept into your bones, and made even the strongest settlers beg for warmth that never came. In diaries, you find these eerie lines. We tried to keep awake, but the snow sang to us. That was the reality. Nature didn't roar, it whispered settlers to death. For centuries, people have been fascinated by tales of survival against the elements. Stories of those who dared to venture into the great outdoors and lived to tell the tale. These stories capture our imaginations, leaving us in awe of the human spirit's resilience. But amidst the tales of triumph over the wild, there's another narrative, one that's less celebrated but equally important. The story of those who didn't make it, those who fell victim to the unforgiving wilderness. In the heart of winter, when the land is blanketed in snow and the air bites with icy winds, the wilderness transforms into a treacherous battleground. Every step is a struggle against the elements, every breath a victory over the cold. For those who underestimate the fury of nature's wrath, the consequences can be dire. Imagine, if you will, a lone traveler making his way through a snow-laden forest. His breath hangs in the frigid air, each step crunching on the frozen ground. The wind whispers through the bare branches, creating a symphony of solitude. As the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows across the snow, our traveler realizes he's lost. Panic starts to rise within him, threatening to consume his thoughts. The realization that night will soon fall and with it, the temperature will plummet, plunging him into a terrifying battle against the cold. As darkness envelops the forest, the temperature drops dramatically. Our traveler shivers uncontrollably, his body struggling to maintain its core temperature. The biting wind seems to pierce his very bones, making every inch of his body feel like it's on fire. With no shelter in sight and the wind growing colder, he knows he won't survive the night if he doesn't take action. Driven by desperation, he begins to run, his lungs burning as he tries to keep his body moving, generating some much-needed heat. But the relentless cold seems to be winning the battle, seeping into his muscles, slowing his movements and numbing his limbs. Just when he thinks he can't go on, he spots a glimmer of hope in the distance, a faint light flickering through the trees. With renewed determination, he stumbles towards it, praying for warmth and safety. As he approaches the light, he sees a cabin, a solitary beacon of hope in the vast wilderness. But as he reaches out to knock on the door, his hand freezes on the frozen wood, a silent scream caught in his throat. The door remains firmly shut, offering him no respite from the freezing temperatures. Unable to call out, he collapses in front of the cabin, defeated by the unforgiving cold. With the warmth of the cabin just beyond his reach, our traveler succumbs to the icy grip of the wilderness, becoming another tragic tale whispered by the wind through the barren trees. His story serves as a grim reminder of the harsh realities of survival against the elements. In the face of such adversity, the human spirit can be an incredibly powerful force. Many have dared to venture into the heart of winter and emerge victorious, their stories serving as beacons of hope and inspiration. Yet it's crucial to remember that for every tale of survival, there are countless others whose journeys ended in tragedy. The wilderness, with its raw natural beauty, demands respect and preparedness, and those who underestimate its power pay the ultimate price. So let the stories of both triumph and tragedy serve as a reminder, urging us to approach the great outdoors with reverence and respect. Let the memory of those who fell to the elements fuel our determination to learn from their mistakes, to plan ahead and to be ever mindful of the challenges that lie ahead. May their sacrifice pave the way for future generations to explore, appreciate, and survive in the wild. The year is 1846, and you are starving to death in a small cabin in the middle of winter. You are trapped inside with your family, and there is no way out. Every cough, every complaint, every whimper of hunger echoes in the cramped space, tempers explode. Some families record violent fights, even murders as the stress becomes too much to bear. Outside, the snow continues to fall relentlessly, mocking your futile attempts to keep warm. The frontier preacher may talk about winter as God's test, but for many, it feels more like God's punishment. Days blur together. You wake up early, stoke the fire, ration the food, then try to sleep while the wind screams outside. All you can think about is food. It's all you can talk about. Yet each day you must force yourself to eat just enough to keep your strength up. Going outside is impossible. The thermometer has been broken for weeks. You don't need it to tell you it's below zero. Each snowflake that falls means another death here in the camp. You envy the birds who can fly south for the winter? Even the squirrels have found a better life in the hollows of trees. What did you do to deserve this, you wonder? Your crime was to leave the old country behind, to seek a new life in the wild frontier. You dreamed of wide open spaces, fresh starts, new opportunities. Now you can't even find enough food to stay alive. Hope, like the birds, has flown south for the winter. Only your will to survive keeps you going. But after a few months, you begin to wonder if that, too, might desert you. You step outside briefly. The biting wind steals your breath. A neighbor's cabin looms in the distance, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. There's always another choice, you think. You could head there, knock on the door and beg for food, or maybe just a place by their fire. But shame stops you. It's easier to die on your feet than live on your knees. Besides, what right do you have to ask for help when you have your own family to feed? You turn back and struggle inside? Children suffer most. You see it in their hollowed-out cheeks, in their listless eyes. They're too young to understand why the world has turned so cold, why their bellies rumble with hunger. All they know is that Mama sings the same sad songs as she rocks them to sleep at night. Papa sits alone by the fire, his face buried in his hands. Sometimes he doesn't even bother to hide his tears. At least the little ones still have milk, you think, watching them sleep. That will give them the strength to pull through. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. The snow piles up against the cabin walls. Still, you hold on to hope. Finally, one morning you hear the sound you've been waiting for. Footsteps in the snow, men's voices. You rush to the window and push aside the frozen pane. 2 men are walking toward you. Their breath hangs in the frosty air like a pair of bluebirds. They're close enough now. You can see the food supplies on their backs. If you flag them down, they can take you and your family off this cursed island. Maybe then you can start to rebuild your lives. You throw open the door. "Help us," you scream, but your voice is hoarse from disuse and the men can't hear you. They hurry past without seeing the gaunt figures pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with hope. Then they disappear around the bend. You watch them go, then slowly lower yourself to the floor, defeated. Winter has claimed another victim. Not the people, but their souls. What's the point of staying alive, you wonder, if all you are is skin and bone? If all you do is dream of food and shiver in the cold? Some say they prayed for death to take them, to release them from their suffering. And as the days grow longer and the sun climbs higher in the sky, they keep their eyes fixed on the gray horizon, waiting for the end. The snow had melted and the river was flowing again. Animals returned from their winter homes and people came out of their houses to greet the spring. It was supposed to be a time of salvation, a fresh start after the long, hard winter. But this spring, the thaw brought its own dangers. Floods washed away the topsoil and with it, the seeds that had just begun to sprout. Food supplies that had been rotting in the ground since last fall were now completely spoiled. People fell sick from eating the rotten meat and vegetables. Those whose bodies had been weakened by the hunger of winter could unfight off the fevers that swept through the starving population. Some didn't survive the spring. Their bodies, starved and frozen for so long, couldn't take the sudden change in temperature. They died, but not from cold or hunger. Instead, they died from the relief of spring. For those who did survive, spring meant rebuilding. Families whose cabins had been destroyed by the winter storms set about repairing their homes. They cleared the debris from their fields and planted new crops. They gathered seeds and began to sow them in the ground, hoping that this year the harvest would be better than the last. They replaced their dead animals, not with the same ones, of course, but with new lambs and chicks that they hoped would grow bigger and stronger than the last. They carried on because what other choice did they have? But as the people worked to rebuild their lives, the scars of winter remained. They saw, in the hollows of their cheeks and the lines on their forearms, the families who had starved. They heard it in the rattling of the old man's bones and the rasp of his cough, the family who had frozen. And they saw it in the wild look in the woman's eyes, the family that had lost their minds. Winter had taken so much from them, but it had not taken everything. They still had each other, and they had hope. They had hope that this year would be different, that the crops would grow and the animals would thrive, that the sun would shine brighter and the days would stay warmer. Each spring was a rebirth, a chance to start over, to forget the horrors of the last one and to hope for a better future. But each spring was also a reminder of what winter had taken, a reminder of the loved ones and neighbors who had perished, and a vow to remember their sacrifice so that it would not be in vain. When we think of frontier life, we picture brave pioneers carving out a new world, a world of adventure, hardship, yes, but also heroism. We think of rugged individuals or families pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and building a life of freedom and prosperity, and sure, some did, but more often than not, it was a struggle just to survive. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this house. Today we are exploring the brutal reality of surviving a winter on the frontier. When we think of the pioneers who pushed across the American frontier, we think of brave adventurers, perhaps even heroes. We imagine them facing down wild animals, hostile natives, and the awesome power of nature itself. We imagine them as rugged individuals or families pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and building a life of freedom and prosperity, and sure, some did. But more often than not, it was a struggle just to survive. Winter was the great equalizer. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, strong or weak. If you didn't prepare, you died. If you prepared, but winter lasted longer than usual, you might still die. It was a gamble every year, and the house, nature, usually won. In fact, when the settlers weren't freezing or starving, they were working frantically to prevent those things from happening. That's why we don't hear many stories about happy pioneer children frolicking through fields of snow, because there usually wasn't much time for that. If there was a blizzard, Mama was up at the first sign of trouble, getting the children into their warmest clothes, maybe even tucking them into the warmest sleeping bags that they had, lining the beds with every blanket they owned, hauling in extra wood for the fire, setting out buckets to catch dripping water, sealing off the windows with their shutters. And then she would start in on the stew, getting it going early so the house would be filled with its delicious smells, making sure that every scrap of meat was used, nothing wasted. She might use every bit of fat on the meat, render it down so that she could use the grease to grease the pan, to cook that stew. Nothing was wasted. And then she would keep the fire going, tending it all night long. She couldn't let it go out. She might have to get up in the middle of the night to feed the fire, to keep it going. It was a battle against the cold, against the darkness, against despair. The brutal truth is that frontier winters weren't heroic tales of courage. They were drawn-out battles with hunger, cold, and despair. And sometimes they were lost battles. Sometimes, despite all the preparations, the cold would seep in around the windows, bite through the layers of clothing, freeze the pipes, and burst the containers holding precious water. Sometimes the wood would run out, forcing the family to make do with a cold hearth and a cold supper. Sometimes the food would run out. Sometimes Mama wouldn't have anything left to feed her children. Those who told stories of their frontier lives rarely wrote about those times. After all, no one wants to hear about a failure, especially not their own. And so the romanticized version of pioneer life has endured, the idea that these were courageous people who faced down nature and won. But they didn't, they just survived. They endured. Sometimes against all odds, sometimes barely, but always with the understanding that nature was an overwhelming force, one that could be respected, even feared, but never truly conquered. The survivors didn't look back with pride. They looked back with relief, not because they had beaten the winter, but because by sheer stubbornness or luck, the winter hadn't beaten them. Thank you for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Please make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an exciting episode.